Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Medlin, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. So welcome. We're glad to have you. As usual, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who is registered, as well as everyone who's attending currently, that has a PDF of the slides and a recording of the webinar. And throughout this presentation, we ask that if you have any questions, there's a little question chat box in your webinar menu. If you want to type those into us, we'll try to save time for them at the end. So with that, we'll go into our slides.
And Lindsay, are you seeing the first slide right now?
I am, Kelly, thank you.
Okay. So, hello, I just want to introduce myself. I am Kelly Prince, and the webinar we are doing today is called Using the Art of Storytelling in Your Classroom. So Lindsay's going to cover a little bit, and then we'll launch right into the content. And give me a second to advance the slide, please. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so thank you, Kelly. Kelly is an award-winning learning professional with over 20 years of experience as a facilitator and course designer. She most recently worked with us at Straightaway to help us develop our instructor-led training solution. So we're really excited to have her with us today. Thank you so much, Kelly, for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited about this.
So for those of you who might not be familiar, Straightaway is part of Bertelsmann's education group. So Bertelsmann is a really large corporation based in Germany that has lots of sub-corporations, and Bertelsmann Education Group is one of the most recently formed. And as part of Bertelsmann Education Group, we recently joined up with Relevance. So Relevance is now our primary parent company. So we're very excited to be part of the Relevance family officially now too.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Appreciate that.
No problem.
So let's go ahead and get started, and I want to give you a little taste of what we're going to cover in the webinar. Basically, we're going to be talking about the art of storytelling, so I wanted to give you a little introduction, tell you what the science says about how effective storytelling is for learning transfer, and then really get into the art of storytelling, starting with the narrative arc. Then we're going to cover some basic story elements that you can use to craft more effective stories in your classroom, and end with some strategies for great storytelling, including a little optional homework if you're up for it. So let's get started. So I want to talk about the importance of stories, and these are things you likely already do. They're really great, especially in the healthcare field, to give your students an emotional understanding of the job. We may teach them a lot of hands-on skills, but there's so much to being a nurse aide, a nurse, a social worker that really takes an emotional commitment. So stories are great for that. They help you draw on your own rich experience, and you can bring meaning to your instructor-led sessions. So it's not just, lecturing. You can have really great discussions and share who you are and what you've done in your job. And as we're going to see with the science, it really does make your learning points more memorable because stories work with how we use memory. And this isn't something you really need to remember per se, but I find it's a really nice foundation to show you how memory really works with learning. So we've got 3 types of learning. We've got incoming information, and that's things that we hear, we see, we touch, and really that sensory memory has a lifespan of about 3 seconds. And so in order to help our learners remember what we're teaching, we need to get it into their working memory. And that's where stories come in. With this limited time frame, your brain decides whether what it hears or sees is relevant or familiar to us. And so then it writes it into that working memory. And that way we can teach new concepts by attaching them to familiar or relevant information. And a story is a great way to do that. Another thing I just want to share about working memory is that it holds between 5 and 9 items or chunks of information at a time. So if you weave those into a story, you've taken many items and connected them into one item, the story, and it's so much easier to remember. So we want to look at when learning occurs, it's because information has moved from our working memory to our long-term memory. And again, we see that with hands-on practice. So if you're learning to transfer a patient or to make a bed, you're using that hands-on practice, that rehearsal, so it goes into long-term memory. What's great about stories is the parts of the brain are activated as if we were experiencing the event. So in essence, stories kind of act like a type of hands-on learning, and I think we're all really bought into how effective hands-on learning is for learning transfer. This slide really just shows you what happens when you use stories to connect information. So say all the little dots in that information box, those are bullets on your slide, and your learner has to remember a lot of different points, remember 5 to 9 chunks of information. But if we tie those together through a story, then that's so much easier to remember because it's one chunk of information and it's relevant. We actually know from neuroscientific research that facts are 22 times more memorable when they're presented in story form. And that also engages other parts of your brain because the learner is painting a picture in their head, and that creates the reality and reinforces meaning. Think about mnemonic devices. They're actually just mini stories. So you may have used something like this in pre-algebra class to remember how to order operations of a calculation. And so really we see all the time that we're using stories in large and small ways to help activate that memory. So the next thing I want to talk about is creating an effective narrative structure. You won't need to remember this pyramid, but it's really something you might see in film school or creative writing class. It's what most movies, especially those from DreamWorks or Pixar, you know, the movies like Up and Cars and Toy Story, they really use this formula. But what you need to remember is the inciting incident, and I'm going to see if I can actually use my pen here. Oops, went too far. All right, here we go. So the inciting incident, the climax, and the resolution. Those 3 things are going to be components we can weave into our own stories. And you're going to see something like this in commercials as well. So they're going to use what's also called plot or story arc to help people feel sympathy for a character or to feel really emotional toward a brand. And so next time you're watching TV, especially during the holidays, those Delta and Public commercials, they have like a little mini vignette, and you can really see how storytelling works in that format. So really, a story is just, in its simplest form, cause and effect. And we think in these narratives all day long, whether we're thinking about how we're going to get to the grocery store on time or what we have to do at home before we go to bed. If you look at these 2 images, they tell a story. Who broke into the safe? Why did they need the money? we just can see a cause and effect, and immediately our brains start exploring all the possibilities because we're really hardwired to think in storylines, just the narrative to point from point A to point B. So when you're thinking about how you're going to use stories in your own classroom, you want to do it called crafting the narrative. And your listener or your student is going to want to know, where is this going and what happens next? And so to kind of illustrate this, maybe think of a time that a narrative pulled you in. I think we've all stayed up too late finishing a book. And those page turners are really compelling narratives. We're invested in the character's outcome, and we can't put it down until we find out what happened. So great storytelling creates characters that we care about. And, we've seen this in the term binge watching. How many of us have just been in front of Netflix for 2 or 3 hours, just, one more episode? Because, again, that narrative is just pulling us in, and we want to find out what's happening. Another concept you'll want to know is narrative tension. Remember, I talked about that conflict? So narrative tension is really the complication in the story that says something happened and it needs resolution. It's what makes a story interesting. We really don't want to hear about when everything went perfectly. We like to hear stories about overcoming the odds or triumphing against adversity. In fact, we learn to craft a story with a narrative from a really young age. If you ask a child, how was your day? You'll see that their speech is already working in the narrative form. They'll tell you, we watched a puppet show, we did our worksheets, and then I spilled glue all over my collage. And already, that's the conflict. And you start asking, well, were you able to save the collage? Did you start over? Were you upset? And then they'll give you a resolution. Say, oh, it was okay. My teacher gave me a new piece of paper, and I made a new one. And then we had snacks. So our jobs, just like, the life of the kindergartner, they're filled with stories. Our first day on the job, handling our first patient death, managing a difficult family, the first time we make a really significant mistake. Conflict really doesn't need to be negative, though. You can find conflict when our expectations don't align with what happens. So maybe it's a positive thing. Maybe a family member that had been taking their frustration out on you comes to you and says, thank you for the job you're doing. Hollywood calls that a plot twist, when a character doesn't do what's expected. So you can use those kind of experiences because every day in long-term care has multiple plot twists. To use a story in a classroom, you need to make it relevant for your learner. So when they're listening, your student's going to think, why should I care? And really, you want to make it relevant because they're thinking, well, I care because they've done the job I want to do. They've made the same mistakes that I want to avoid. They have experience I could learn from, or they've felt the way I do, especially when I'm nervous about my first day on the job, or I don't know how to do this, and I'm afraid to ask someone. So all those experiences are really ripe for stories, and you can really share what you've learned about, a resident who had cancer or diabetes, and what you did, what mistakes you made, and what you learned from it. How many times have you stopped reading a book or a movie, stopped watching a movie or a TV show because you just couldn't relate to the character? It's really key to create relatable characters that people either care about or at least have some kind of interest in. So your learners are going to ask, can I see myself in this character, or is this like someone I know? Do I care about this person? And overall, am I seeing growth? We see a lot of narratives on TV or in fiction where you've got a character that's a little flawed, but at the end of the story, they've really gone through a lot and they're a better person. So, in our own jobs, you're really going to see relatable characters. Your own workplaces provide you a rich cast of characters. And in your own stories, they can be your residents, your past students and staff, and yourself, most of all. When you're crafting a narrative, this goes back to memory. You really want to pay attention to detail. And that doesn't mean you need to provide, say, the detail of a Harry Potter novel, but you want to use details to paint a picture of what was going on. So talk about what the weather was like outside or what the resident wore. Maybe they had a purple sweater on. Maybe the bedspread was red, or it was something that was a family heirloom that they brought to their own personal room. Really, details drive the brain to respond to a story as if it were happening to them. And you can use details very sparingly, just enough to allow the learner to paint a picture in their own head. And if you use those details at key moments you want your audience to remember, it's going to help them with the learning points that you're working on. So putting it all together, because this isn't a webinar on screenwriting, it's a webinar on using the art of storytelling in your classroom. So the first step is to determine what you need the students to remember about the material. Your story should incorporate the learning points in a meaningful way. You can frame this as a problem to be solved. Some of the examples you could use are stories about how I protected my patient's personal health information, how I prevented an infection, how I reported a symptom that prevented a patient's decline. So think about what you're trying to teach and then craft your story around that. Tie the key learning points into the story. You want to establish a setting. This is something we see all the time in movies and TV. It's what that inciting incident is. So you want to establish an opening frame, so to speak. Something like, it was 2002 and my first day as a nurse aide at the rehab center in Houston. Your opening sentence should grab the attention of the learners. Already, something's happening, and you're describing a setting that nurse aides or whoever your students are will really see as relevant to their own futures. Have something happen. So opening that story with an inciting incident is going to keep them engaged. So you've established your setting, and then you add in the adult children of my COPD patient were hovering over me at the nurse's station, demanding to see their father's latest lab results. So that's a really interesting way to frame a discussion around personal health information rather than going through the bullet points of why it's important to protect it. From the first paragraph, your learners are going to want to know what you did to manage that situation. And you can tie it into several lessons, kind of showing that thread of the narrative throughout. And finally, plan the narrative. You want to, before you start talking, know how your story is going to end. This can be some bullet points or note cards, whatever works for you. Maybe just practice it a couple times till it's in your memory. But you want to take some time to ensure you hit the high points, have some narrative tension, have some conflict, and know what the resolution is. Again, tying it back to the learning point. So in addition to having the knowledge of what makes a great story, it's really important to become a student of storytelling. I like to write a lot, and they say that the best way to become a better writer is to read all the time. So the best way to become a better storyteller is to listen to people telling stories. And I think just being aware of stories, you're going to notice them everywhere from now on. But I wanted to give you a list of where I find inspiration for my stories. The first is the Moth Radio Hour. It's a podcast, and I've got the website here. You can actually just listen on the website as well. It's a podcast about normal, everyday people just telling stories in a 10 to 15 minute format. And it's really about life experiences. Some of them are really poignant about people overcoming a cancer diagnosis or losing a child, but it's an excellent podcast and really, really inspiring. This American Life is another podcast that is just really the standard for storytelling. It's got 3 to 4 stories around a theme, and the creator, Ira Glass, is considered one of the best storytellers in radio. Serial, especially season 1, is actually a podcast by an executive producer of This American Life. And I don't know if you remember, a couple years ago, it was really all the rage, and it actually had a parody skit on Saturday Night Live. It's really fun. And then anything by Gimlet Media. And just because Ira Glass has influenced so much about audio storytelling, the creator of Gimlet Media, Alex Blumberg, has created all these great shows: The Habitat, Startup, Mystery Show, Without Fail. I encourage you to explore them all. I listen to podcasts when I'm working out, when I'm walking my dog, when I'm driving. So it's a great way to just learn something and, fill some time you wouldn't normally have anything to do but get frustrated anyway. And then another great source for storytelling is actually comedians. There are some comedians that are kind of like one-liner people, but most comedians are really great storytellers. So if you watch anything on Netflix, they have just a whole huge section with, live comedy. And you can learn a lot about how to unfold a narrative. These are a few of my favorite comedians. Seth Meyers has a brand new Netflix special called Lobby Baby, and he tells the story of how his second child was literally born in the lobby of his apartment. The Tennessee Kid is just wild stories. Both these two are actually really clean, especially for Netflix. And then Mike Birbiglia, John Mulaney. Anything you like to watch, just look for the stories, and you'll really see how things unfold. So here's your homework. If I can advance the slide. I've lost my cursor. There we go. So next time you watch a TV show or movie, you want to look for the following. What was the conflict? What details do you remember? What about the characters was relatable? And how was the conflict resolved? And as you start observing these, you're going to see what makes sense for you and your own style and comfort level in the classroom. And you're going to really have a lot of tools to start using storytelling in your classroom and really engaging your learners. All right, I've got all my references here, so you are welcome to check out these articles. Really interesting stuff if you're want further knowledge about anything I've talked about here. And then we want to leave some time for questions. We've got about 6 minutes left before 2:30, and I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. All right, so we did have a couple of questions come through. Okay. Is it better to make up stories to reinforce a lesson, or should I share my own experiences?
That is a great question, and it actually reminds me of something that I did want to mention. If you are doing e-learning, making up stories is called a scenario. So in that case, creating a composite character or someone that's loosely based on the experience, if you're more comfortable, I think that works just as well. If you're uncomfortable sharing your own experience, definitely make up some characters as long as they're relevant and have all the components that will make them interesting. I think that's actually a really great idea.
Great. Okay, and next question. How can I be sure if I'm telling stories of my own experiences, including my mistakes, that I'm still setting a good example for my students?
That's tricky, isn't it? I think we all make mistakes, and I've seen kind of in corporate culture, healthcare culture, that people are really looking to fail forward. So, if you're learning something from what you're doing and really show that you've grown from it, I think that's fine. It also helps your students realize that they're not going to be perfect, that they're going to make mistakes. And it's, really important to make, the smaller mistakes versus the bigger mistakes. But I think you can frame it in a way that you learn something from it, that next time you did better, that you did the right thing when you made the mistake, and you can show that not everyone's perfect, and we don't expect you to be perfect, but we expect you to do your best and to grow and to learn.
That's great. All right, well, that looks like those are all of our questions. So with that, Kelly, I think we can go ahead. Oh, hang on. I've got a hand raised.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. Oh, I just lost my cursor. Oh. Sandra and Betty, if you guys have questions, you can type them in the little question box down here at the bottom. Because I see y'all's hands are raised, but if not, we can wrap it up.
And if you have questions that you think about later, you email Sherry or Debbie, or you can actually, I encourage you to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with you. It's Kelly Prince on LinkedIn. And I'm always happy to talk about anything learning related, anything story related, anything healthcare related. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I've learned in my career, and I think you're all going to do a great job in your classroom sharing your experiences.
Okay, so Sandra typed in her question, how can we obtain your references? So I will be sending out a copy of these slides. I'll send out a PDF, and all of Kelly's references will be on there for you to access. And in that same vein, you can also reply directly to that email once it sends, and that will come to me with any additional questions that you guys might have. I can forward those on to Kelly or Sherry or Debbie. And I think that's everything. I think we're ready to give you guys back your afternoons.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for attending. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.